technologies, including in the power sector, coal, natural gas, and renewable energy. And in the vehicle fleet, implications of increased penetration of electric vehicles and storage on carbon emissions and air quality. She has her bachelor and master's degrees from IST in Portugal and a PhD in engineering and public policy from Carnegie Mellon University, where she's remained and has been promoted up the chain as professor there for the last, I guess,
since 2009.
Since 2009, so the last 6 or 7 years.
Thank you.
We're really interested in what you have to tell us. Take it away.
So it's a pleasure to be here today. I'll be talking about the climate, health, and environmental consequences of several different interventions that we can pursue in the US electricity system, and really getting at the issue of where are we saving CO2, where are we reducing pollution that would help with health and environmental consequences. As it was mentioned by Denise, at Carnegie Mellon, I lead jointly with Professor Granger Morgan a Center on Climate and Energy Decision Making. This effort started back in 2010. We're very fortunate to have funding from the National Science Foundation since then. In the first round of the center for 5 years between 2010 and 2015, where we granted $6 million, and recently we've been awarded a second round of funding until 2020. So we're very thankful to Carnegie Mellon, to the National Science Foundation for that. This is an effort that goes across several institutions that are shown in the map, and we have several faculty involved both at Carnegie Mellon and at other research institutions. This has been a large effort where we have 62 PhD students affiliated with the CEDM, and so far more than 200 peer-reviewed papers since the center's inception in 2010. So that's all I'll say about the center, and I'll be happy to address more questions after the talk on that. My own key research interests are threefold: to understand energy systems, and in particular the engineering and economic feasibility of sustainable, affordable, and socially just energy efficient in use systems and low carbon generation. And then on the policy front, I'm interested in using methods that both look at simulation of policies or looking retrospectively at what policies have delivered using econometric analysis. And in particular, avoiding having unintended consequences from the development of such policies. And I'll be happy to chat about a few examples. And finally, if we were to achieve a large transition to sustainable energy systems, we need to think about people and the way they make decisions. So a third stream of work has been to try to understand how people make choices towards energy technologies, and how do they behave once they, for example, adopt efficient lighting or change the type of retail rate that they are under. What I'll be talking about today is really this issue about how different interventions, and by interventions I mean increasing renewables, increasing storage, increasing energy efficiency or vehicle electrification, change the damages that we'll see as a result from the US electricity grid. And so those are sort of questions such as, are we helping the environment more by increasing solar PV in California or in Pennsylvania? Are we helping the environment more if we choose a battery electric car or an hybrid across different locations in the United States? Or which states will have the largest environmental and health benefits associated with more stringent building codes? Where are we going to have the largest environmental and health benefits from increasing wind across the United States? As we pursue storage in the grid in different locations, are we actually increasing or decreasing the emissions that we're imposing on the system? And finally, I'm looking at some emerging strategies that have not been used for climate mitigation, but that can provide some interesting results. For example, looking at data centers that provide your services for Netflix or Hulu, and start thinking about, can we shift where those loads come from and which data centers are serving different regions in the country, and shift that almost on an hourly basis as a way to reduce emissions. I won't talk as much about this one, but I'll be happy to share the results. So when we look at energy services that are contributing as greenhouse gas emissions to the grid, Transportation and electricity are by far the largest ones, contributing each with about 30%. This year, for the first time in the United States, the emissions from transportation are surpassing those of electricity from a variety of reasons. So it makes sense to focus on those two sectors as initial climate mitigation strategies. It is also the case that the US fleet, though we see new capacity additions, is old and heavily based on coal. What I'm showing in this plot is the first year of operation by fuel type since the 1950s and until today of different power plants. And you see that in the 70s we had large additions of coal. In the early 2000s we had large additions of natural gas, which, as you know, were mostly single cycle and not extremely efficient natural gas power plants. And in recent years we see the increase in capacity for wind and solar, in addition to increases in natural gas in some portions of the country. A word of caution that I'm showing this stuff in terms of capacity added, not electricity generated. As you know, for wind and solar, we may need to decrease this by 1/3 if we start comparing electricity generation from different sources, given the capacity factors and efficiencies. It also does not make sense to talk about the carbon intensity of US grid as a single number. There is an enormous variability in the numbers across the US grid. What I'm displaying over here is for the most recent year for which we have data. So in 2015, the average carbon intensity for different states, and this is really as function of total electricity generated in that state, including renewables. And so you see that really some states are already at very low carbon intensities to compare to others. So we have an enormous variability in the carbon intensity of the emissions, and this behavior, when you look at it on an hourly level or seasonal level, you unmask several other variabilities that are going on. This is true not only in terms of CO2 emissions, but also when we start looking at the damages from criteria pollutants. Well, CO2, we can assume that it mixes globally, and we can assume a social cost of carbon. If we want to go in that route, that will be the same everywhere. When we look at the criteria pollutants, though, things vary enormously across the country. They depend on which air quality model you're using, the value of statistical life that you're assuming too. Over here, just for illustration, I'm showing the same ton of SO2 being emitted in different counties across the United States. And you see that the damages would range from something like $1,000 for that ton of SO2 in some county, and as high as $15,000 per ton of SO2 in another. And don't get too hooked on the specific of those numbers. They are extremely uncertain depending on the assumptions that you use for valuation of health damages and air quality models. But there is a big variation across the country. So the goal of the research that I'll be showing you is, first, what are the regional and hourly marginal emissions factors that are derived from the US grid? And second, what are the health, environmental, and climate change consequences of the grid today? And how will those change as we pursue different types of interventions, renewable storage, efficiency, and so on in our energy system? And finally, translating that on what are the monetized benefits or costs that we get from those interventions. I already motivated the need for accounting for the geographically specific emissions. There is also the need to try to understand exactly what sorts of generators are being ramped up and down and contributing to the emissions as we pursue different types of interventions in the grid. So in the first plot, this is an hypothetical system. It doesn't correspond to any specific region, but I'm showing a simple dispatch with the marginal cost of operation for different types of plants. So starting with cheap hydro, followed by nukes and coal. And in the plot below, I'm just showing the corresponding emissions intensity, carbon emissions intensity of that same system. The point being that if we displace a little bit of energy at hours of peak load, we may be displacing a natural gas power plant that is ramping down a little bit. Whereas in some other hours where the total demand is 6 gigawatts, we will be displacing a coal power plant at the margin. So when we use average emissions factors throughout the year, we don't incorporate those sorts of changes from hour to hour. And this may be problematic. So imagine for a storage device, for example, on that you'd assume that the emissions when you charge and discharge the battery are zero. But if you take into account the timing of when you charge and discharge that battery, then the emissions are not going to be zero, and we'll see what those are. So I'll show the results from different interventions in the grid. Solar, where we're going to simulate 900 sites across the United States. Wind, where we're going to simulate 33,000 sites across the United States. Electric vehicles with different types of vehicles that are completely battery electric or hybrid vehicles and so on. We've also looked at applications for storage, which I'll also highlight, and I'll skip the results from the ones on data centers, buildings, and lighting, but I'll be happy to discuss those with you offline. So let's look at the first question. Are we helping the environment by increasing solar in California or in Pennsylvania? So the way we looked at this in the modeling approach was first, we took for every single county the damages in dollars per ton as a function of stack height and pollutant for SO2, NOx, and PM. The results that you'll see are from AP2 model, so corresponding to the model from Nick Mueller and with the range of damages that you see in this map. We're rerunning all the results with yet another model, easier at Carnegie Mellon University, and comparing the results from those models, so I'm not going to show that. So what AP2 does, and this has been described previously in the National Research Council report on hidden cost of energy, what it does, it's really estimating the dispersion of pollutants resulting from and resulting concentrations in all US counties with one marginal ton of emissions at a time. And it uses those response functions to estimate the physical impacts in terms of health effects, reduced crop and timber yields, degradation of materials, and so on. And finally, it monetizes the impacts. In the results that I'll show, we were using a statistical life of 6 million. This is by far one of the most uncertain numbers that one could ask, and that may drive the results in different ways. We also account for the monetized impacts on market value of lost commodities and so on. So the results from AP or AP2 model provide the average county dollar per ton damages from each of those pollutants emitted by point sources. Then for CO2, at the time for the results that I'm showing, we were using the $20 per ton of CO2, which was close to the first recommendation from the interagency working group. And our results scale linearly to the assumption that we have for the social cost of carbon. So we are now rerunning the results with $40 per ton and using the sensitivity analysis across those numbers. Then we have the characterization of 1,400 power plants in the United States. So for those plants, we have every single fossil fuel power plant that is larger than 25 megawatts. The other ones are not included in this data set. And for each of those plants, we have the location, the fuel type, the stack height, and the reported hourly emissions for CO2, SO2, and NOx. So this is actually something quite unique to the United States, and I haven't found similar data sets for other countries, where the EPA, through the Clean Air Act, mandates that the power plants need to report the actual hourly emissions and generation. So those are not estimated emissions, but the actual values on an hourly basis, which provides a very rich data set for us as modelers. So that data comes from the continuous emissions monitoring system. That data set does not include direct PM 2.5 emissions, so for that we need to rely on the national emissions inventory, and we make an assumption that the hourly emissions, direct emissions of PM, are proportional to generation, so that we can downscale and have on an hourly basis estimates of PM2. And finally, we have the emissions and generation data with the plant locations and fuel type from eGrid. Okay, then for each eGrid subregion, and I'm showing the picture of the eGrid subregions in that map, we compute the hourly damages associated with the emissions as the damages in dollars per ton times the hourly emissions in tons of pollutant per hour. Now, there are a couple of problems with this assumption, right? We're assuming that the hourly emissions consequences to exposure are the same as the long-term exposure damages. And this is an area where refining to understand short-term consequences of exposure versus long-term will provide a new and rich research. And then for each of those regions, we divide the data into 20 gross generation bins. Why do we do that? Because after we parse out the data into generation bins from very low generation to very high generation, we can actually approximate the slope of the damages with simple linear functions. So what you see is that we look at the changes in damages, in dollars per hour, as function of changes in generation for each of those bins. Let me zoom in. So this is for Texas, for ERCOT, and looking just at the damages associated with SO2 emissions. And so we're plotting the changes in damages as function of changes in generation. And so we see that in hours of low demand, the damage associated with operating the power plant in Texas corresponds to about $90 per megawatt hour. This is because at those hours we have perhaps some coal and oil power plants that are operating at the margin. Whereas in hours of very high demand, you'll have things like natural gas at the margin, so there is no emissions of SO2, and therefore there is no damages associated with those. So we do this for every pollutant and for every region, and so that ultimately we end up with a mapping of marginal damages as function of total generation for each of those regions. Let me zoom in again. So what we're matching over here is, for example, in hours of very low demand, we have a damage associated with SO2 that is fairly large, and in hours of high demand, that damage is virtually zero. Okay, with this step, we have a reasonable characterization of the damages as function of generation for all those different pollutants and for different regions in the grid. Now, what we'd like to do is to map this with marginal interventions that we're pursuing, increasing wind a little bit, increasing solar a little bit in those regions. So what do? We look at each of the wind and solar sites, and we look at the output that the plants at those sites would have for each hour of the year. And we map out for each hour what are the damages in terms of pollution that could have been avoided by incrementally increasing wind and solar. Now, another word of caution on the modeling approach, this makes sense if we're looking at interventions at the margin, increasing solar or wind a little bit. If we were to include large adoption and simulating a large adoption for wind and solar, we could still do this with this method, but if you can see my arrow, we'll need to take into account the slope that we're having in terms of decreases in generation associated with that larger share. And it comes to a point where, because we're using historical data from the last couple of years of operation of the grid, at some point if we're simulating a 30% overnight addition of wind, it doesn't make sense to use historical data because the system would fundamentally be operated in different ways. So just to make sure. Okay, so by taking those steps, we can then look overall for different locations, what is the dollar of damages avoided per megawatt hour generated by wind or solar in the different locations, and the attribution of the contribution to CO2 emissions avoided PM or SO2. So let's see what this looks like for solar PV. The key take-home message is that the locations that have the best solar output are not the ones that are going to provide us with the largest social benefits, with the largest health and environmental benefits. So in the first plot, I'm just showing you the capacity factors of solar PV panels that are installed in those 900 different points and interpolating between points. There's nothing surprising here. This is the sort of maps that you see from NREL and so on. The best resources for solar are going to be Arizona, New Mexico, and Southern California. Indeed, a PV panel in Arizona is going to provide 45% more electricity than a solar panel in Maine. So there are important regional differences about the outputs of solar that we can get. Now, let's look at the same solar panel, same kilowatt of PV installed in different locations across the country, and what does it get us in terms of avoided CO2? And you see that the answer is quite different. Because of the enormous discussions about what we should assume for the social cost of carbon associated with the reductions in emissions of CO2, we're presenting the results both in terms of the kilograms of CO2 that are avoided per year by the panel and the equivalent social benefit from reducing CO2 emissions, again under the assumption of the $20 per ton of CO2. So what's going on here? Well, if your goal as a policymaker is to reduce CO2 emissions, that same solar panel should be incentivized and placed in Kansas, Nebraska, or the Dakotas. The resources are fairly moderate for solar, as you can see on the map on the left, but you're displacing carbon-intensive coal power plants on that location. So that's where you should site your solar PV panels. Now, if as a decision maker you care mostly about the health and environmental consequences associated with air pollution, the locations are again going to be different. So here in the scale I'm bundling together the avoided damages from SO2, NOx, and PM. And once again we're looking at the dollars of avoided damages per kilowatt of PV installed. And so you see that the PV in Ohio would provide 17 times the health and environmental benefits of a PV panel in Arizona, even though the solar PV in Ohio produces 30% less energy. Again, as words of caution, all of these things are fairly uncertain depending on the numbers that you use to embed the models. We're doing a lot of sensitivity analysis to see where there is some robust. In any case, if you have locations where you have coal at the margin, and those locations are, the locations where your site or plants are upstream where the pollution is going to end, and those locations are heavily populated, those are basically the places where you get the largest benefits from having solar. Okay, let's look at what happens when we look at wind interventions. The locations that provide the largest electricity output, we find that those align quite well with those that provide the largest CO2 benefits, but not criteria pollutants. So let's look. The first map, once again, is showing you just the capacity factors of wind installed in different locations across the country. And we see that the wind turbines perform the best in the Great Plains, where you have very high capacity factors, sometimes in the range of 40%. And when we look at the CO2 emissions avoided, there is a nice alignment here. In the Midwest, the wind resources are excellent, and at the same time, you'll be primarily displacing coal-fired generators. So those are good locations for siting wind. But finally, if you look at the health and environmental benefits, and those are the key goal for you as a policymaker, then you see that you have other locations where you're better off by siting wind. Indeed, a wind turbine in West Virginia will displace 7 times the health effects of a wind turbine in Oklahoma, and 27 times when compared to California. One of the questions that can arise is we're providing subsidies to these energy technologies, such as the production tax credit for wind. What this map is showing is, till a couple of years ago, where the wind farms are sited, and just for a sense of scale, that the largest bar that you see in Texas corresponds to 735 megawatts. And so our question was, okay, for the wind that we have out there, did the benefits, the social benefits in terms of health, environment, and climate change exceed the subsidy that we're providing to those wind installations? So we computed the benefits using our same method and conclude that the annual benefits from wind farms are about $2.8 billion. And the annual cost that we've been spending with the production tax credit was about $1.6 billion. This is good news. So we're providing incentives for wind, and the health and climate change benefits that we're deriving from that installed base that we have today for wind exceed the cost. Incidentally, we've looked at the same thing for solar. We just computed that and are now submitting that paper, and the results are different there. So the costs of solar still today exceed the benefits. The installed base also, the costs exceed the benefits. And even if we were to install all the solar that we already have out there at today's cost, the cost would exceed the benefits. So that's one conclusion.
Just a clarification, the benefits here include both health and CO2?
Correct. So they include both health, environmental, and climate
So
change.
what's the price per ton of CO2 that you're assuming?
We're assuming $20 per ton of CO2. So it would be even a better case for wind if we're replacing this with the $14 per ton.
So is this 2.6 billion more from health or from CO2? Do you remember?
So I don't have for the overall nation, but I have for 2 regions so that we have a sense. The largest part was actually from health. The very interesting question too is that our grid is changing very rapidly. And so this was data up until 2014. I can tell you that if I start running this now for 2015 and 2016, because natural gas being at the margin more frequently, suddenly the health damages that you avoid decrease quite substantially and are fairly small. And as I'll show at the end of the talk though, one of the things that we are producing is an online tool that I'm happy to make available for everyone that produces, every time we have new data from SAMS, we're computing the marginal emissions and marginal damages from 2 air quality modelers so that that data is out there and can be used for new intervention analysis. Okay, but an important point is that this stuff varies quite importantly across regions, so that when you look at the health, environmental and climate change damages that you get in Pennsylvania and in California, those in Pennsylvania are much larger because you are displacing coal and in densely populated areas, but both regions receive the same incentive, the same PTC, right? So you have some regions that are now getting more incentive than the social benefits that they deliver, whereas others are given an incentive that is below the social benefit that they deliver. I'm not advocating that the PTC should be changed in any ways, but it's an important effect that is going on. So there are several limitations and key assumptions in our model. So for example, in the results that you've seen, we treat every region independently and we don't take into account imports and exports between regions. We're now doing that. The second thing is how the assumptions about the value of statistical life will influence the results. So one of the things that we've done is rerun our results under different assumptions of what to use as a value of statistical life. So you see over here for 5 different regions, different cases of assessment just to understand the sensitivity. In the first case, the baseline assumption of $6 million. In the second case, we use also the VLS of $6 million, but we account for the life year method, accounting for the distribution of the demographics in the different regions. Then we include a low and high case for VSL of 2 million and 10 million. And finally, we also rerun the results with an alternative dose response function. The takeaway message is that the magnitude of those benefits is going to change, or damage is going to change depending on the location. It doesn't really change in order across regions as it is to be expected. The other big question is we have a change in the electricity fleet, so how can we account for that? So what we've done is we identified the planned retirements for coal-fired plants across the United States. And so we assume that we would have 30 gigawatts of coal that will be retired. And we use the selection criteria of using the oldest plants and the ones that were the highest emitting in terms of SO2 as the ones that would be retired. And this was informed by the data from the EIA. And so we have rerun our results, assuming that those plants are going to be retired. In their place, in the same hours of operation, we'll have natural gas power plants. And this is what it looks like. So on the left, we have the base case with the current fleet. On the right, you see what happens if we retire 30 gigawatts of coal. And you see that this influences almost entirely what is going on just in the RFC region, which is where all those old coal power plants are located anyways. Another interesting thing is that we use the valuation of emissions of SO2 and NOx and PM in terms of their health damages. But the question changes if we assume that the emissions markets are binding, because in that case, effectively, you won't have additional emissions from SO2 above whatever the binding target is for those emissions per the market. So we re-simulated everything, but under assumption that the NOx and SO2 markets would indeed move forward. And we assumed instead the allowance prices in those markets instead of the health damages. Though, to be fair, for the period of analysis that we looked at, that really doesn't make sense because at that time the NOx and SO2 markets were not binding. So when you look at the SO2 allowance prices, for example, over time, for the period of analysis that we were simulating, the allowance prices were just zero. The market was not ongoing. But there is an expectation that the cross-state air pollution rule, or CSPREE, is going to move forward. And the EPA has put out an analysis that shows what would be the resulting allowance prices if one is to comply with the cross-state air pollution rule. So we rerun our analysis assuming that the allowance prices from the EPA hold. And as it's not extremely surprising to see that the overall benefits associated with solar then decrease substantially. This is because the allowance prices that we see are much, much lower than the health damages that at the margin are provided from operating power plants in the United States. So this is all in what concerns wind and solar. I'll move on to this question of, are we helping the grids by adding storage to our electricity grid? There is this prevalence of thinking that storage is somehow green. Indeed, the Storage Technology for Renewable and Green Energy Act, or storage, back in 2013, proposed changes to the internal revenue code so that the energy investment tax credit would be provided to any storage connected to the grid. And in California, back in 2010, the Senate passed AB 2514, directing the California Public Utility Commission to determine the appropriate requirements for energy storage. And by 2013, the California PUC had mandated the three major utilities to collectively add 1.3 gigawatt of storage by 2020. Now, whether storage is green or not will depend on how it is operated. When used for energy arbitrage, storage is basically going to be charged when the prices are low. This generally will occur at night, and coal will be at the margin across a portion of the country. And it will discharge during peak hours when electricity is the most valued, and the evening periods when natural gas is going to be at the margin. If we use average emissions factors throughout the year, we conclude that the emissions are zero. But that's not going to be the case when we take into account those temporal effects. The second effect is that storage technologies are not 100% efficient. So they will incur some losses when they store and recover the energy. So extra electricity is added. Well, when you consume that extra electricity, you have yet again a penalty on emissions. So we developed a model that looks at storage operators that are trying to maximize their revenue using a linear programming optimization model. And we use two scenarios, perfect information and imperfect information. Under perfect information, we assume that the storage operators know what the LNPs are going to be, what those prices are going to be in the market, and they can just optimize what to do. And in imperfect information, we have the assumption that they basically charge if the price is below a certain value and sell if it is above a certain value. So the key finding is that under the current grid, the emissions are going to occur to increase in many locations, in most locations. So in this first plot, I'm just showing the annual revenue that the storage operators would get from operating storage. And you see that there is some money to be made, but not big money. And now let's look at what happens for the CO2 emissions. We didn't have any data for the states that are shown in white, so please disregard those. But you see that the emissions of CO2 increase everywhere across the United States when we allow for energy arbitrage. And all these results are under the assumption of perfect information, just for sake of time. For NOx emissions, we also see that in the vast majority of the regions, we have an increase in emissions, with the exception of Texas and a few of the states in the Northeast. And for SO2 emissions, we also see that in most regions, with the exception of California and the Northeast, the SO2 emissions would be increased. So we haven't paired this up with the damages valuation yet, we're just looking at the emissions, but you see that this doesn't make a very good case for storage to be green when looking at energy out of the trash.
Just for point of clarification, that's for the current existing grid as of 2015 or something like that?
2014, and where we were using the entire data set from 2011 to 2014. So it's glad that you bring that point. If we rerun this now for 2015, which we'll be doing, these effects are going to start washing out. And if we continue to see natural gas and renewable increases, soon it will become a point where storage will indeed be a net emission reducer.
That's an important point to keep in mind, that the grid is evolving and storage will become increasingly environmentally beneficial.
Completely correct. And so the calculation that we're doing right now is how much natural gas or renewables do you need to add in different locations for storage to be at least emission neutral. Yeah, and I do want to reiterate that point. For all of the things that we're looking at, there is really this clear distinction that the results hold for right now, but that we do need to look carefully about what is being added to the grid in recent years and how that will change the results. So I'm not claiming that this will hold on for the next 20 years or so. Finally, are we helping the environment when we choose a battery electric car or an hybrid? Well, we looked at different types of vehicles, from conventional to hybrid electrics to plug-in hybrid electrics or battery, and characterized them as follows. We're modeling this at the county level using a life cycle model for the emissions that includes weather. Weather is important because it's going to affect the performance of the battery. Driving conditions, and by driving conditions, I mean that we take into account the number of miles that are driven by folks in different counties and whether the counties are urban versus rural, and the number of VMT that are driven in different locations. And we take into account the electricity emissions rates in those locations by accounting both for marginal plant emissions and upstream emissions by region. And so we couple all of this information together to try to identify, as a user, what is the vehicle that you should select if your goal is to reduce CO2 emissions. Okay, so you'll see this plot being populated. We're comparing the vehicles on the left, so the Nissan Leaf, which is a battery electric vehicle, the Chevy Volt, which is a plug-in hybrid electric vehicle, and the Toyota Prius, the new model of the Toyota Prius, which is a plug-in hybrid. And we're going to compare it to two more conventional vehicles. The old Toyota Prius, which is simply an hybrid, but not a battery electric, and the Mazda 3, which is a conventional gasoline vehicle, which has a very good performance. So it's the best performance in terms of emissions across conventional vehicles. And so we're going to see in cases that are going to be showing up in red, correspond to locations where your plug-in electric vehicle emits more than the conventional vehicle. Locations in blue is where you're better off by transitioning to electrification for each of those cases. Okay, so we see the comparison between the three electrified vehicles and the old Toyota Prius. And what do we find? We find that there are many locations across the United States where you're better off by adopting your old hybrid Toyota Prius rather than one of the advanced electrified vehicles. This would be in locations where you have coal at the margin, or locations where you have rural counties where you have a lot of highway driving, and locations where you have cold weather, and so the battery performance of the electric vehicles is not so good. In the case of comparing the Chevy Volt with the Toyota Prius, you're better off with having your old Toyota Prius almost everywhere. And this is because the Volt consumes more gasoline per mile in charge-sustaining mode after the battery is depleted than the Prius. And finally, when comparing the new Prius, the plug-in hybrid and electric version, with the old hybrid Prius, you see that the the plug-in version consumes less gasoline than the hybrid version in city driving conditions, and more otherwise. So that one is a little bit more washed. When you compare the electrified vehicles to the Mazda 3, then you see that you're better off by having electrification instead of keeping the conventional gasoline vehicle in many locations across the country, except as you see in the red states where you have the combination of being more rural areas and the cold weather and the cold in some instances making a difference. So in terms of a few final notes, whereas there are problems and unintended consequences with some of those technologies, we do know that an enormous transition in our energy system is needed, and so the statements are by no means to say that we shouldn't push those technologies, but we need to be cognizant that there may be some effect in between, and that if anything else, it's critical to clean the electric grid so that we have indeed the intended savings from all those other interventions. The second key message is that focusing on just greenhouse gas and criteria pollutants separately may miss some important points, and so that policy analysis and analysis of technologies should include both at the same time. And that we now have data to understand a little bit better the implications of location, of temporal patterns and behavior, and all those things are going to be determinants of whether the outcomes that we have from interventions are the ones we're wishing for. As I mentioned, we're making all our data available in terms of marginal and average emissions factors and damages by hour, day, season, balancing area, state, and the grid region. The data, the online data set right now looks a little bit like this. You can select whether you want your data to be based on generation or demand of energy. That makes a little bit of a difference, even imports and exports across regions. Whether you want to look at average emissions factors or marginal, what sort of regional aggregation you want to select, balancing areas, state, NERC, and so on. The years of analysis, and you can have the outputs in terms of an actual spreadsheet that you can use for your analysis, as well as this source of plots. And so I'll end it up to have some time also for questions. Thank you so much for your attention.
So I have a question about the first part. So one of the components that go into your model is the dispersion of pollutants and the exposure. Now, I wonder if you use kind of average conditions for this, because if you think about it, when wind is blowing and displacing emissions, it's really the most favorable meteorological conditions for dispersion. So wind is displacing emissions at the time when these emissions will have minimal health impacts. And if you take that into account, it probably would reduce the health benefits of wind and solar also, because when sun is shining, there's a lot of thermal mixing in the lower atmosphere. So is that something you considered, or?
We didn't, and it's a great point. So no, that in fact the models don't take into account those sorts of effects, and it will be great if there are air quality models that want to work with us on that. No, we don't take that into account. So, and your point is completely correct in the way that drives the results.
So just following along on that point, first I want to say I think great integrated assessment is important, and it's really useful to see how all these things play off against each other. So I think it's a huge contribution. So as we discussed this morning, I have some grave reservations about the air quality model that's being used here. Dispersion does not capture all of air pollution. And it's, from what I understand from what you're showing, it's just SO2 that you're looking at. And of course, there's also NOx.
Oh no, it's also NOx. So it also includes NOx.
So the change in PM 2.5, you actually are including the secondary PM formation for SO2 and for NOx?
No, so direct emissions for NOx, direct emissions of SO2, secondary formation from PM from SO2, and direct emissions of PM. You're right. Yeah. So secondary formation of NOx.
Power plants emit very little direct PM, so it's really a reliance only on the SO2. And the chemistry of how that conversion is going on, I don't think it's very well resolved. I know that there's a trade-off in being able to do these simulations for lots and lots of different counties and stuff like that, but I think it would be really worth understanding well how that is actually simulating air quality levels in order to have some level of confidence in the health effects that you get from that. And think it's critically important because I think that this work is going to be really powerful and persuasive. But if the model is wrong, it's then, I suspect, going to be under-predicting the health benefits of transitions because it's really underestimating a lot of the bipartisan formation.
So a couple of things. I do agree with your concerns. We are also using the Carnegie Mellon recent air quality model called EASIER and starting to compare the estimates. And actually, let me do one thing, which is because I do think that would be relevant.
I think it's a very powerful analysis. It'll be quite persuasive. I just am worried that it's to not underestimate the impact.
So let me see. I'll take one other question that I do want to show this result, which is, okay, here we go. Okay, so I mentioned that we're looking now at the costs and benefits of solar, and we're transitioning to use Peter Adams' model EASIER as the base case for that. But just to give you a sense, so what this plot shows is for different years using that model, what have been the benefits of 1 kilowatt of solar PV. So this takes into account the fact that the damages are going to be changing from year to year as the grid becomes more clean. And so you see that for CO2 between 2006 and 2014, we see a little bit of a change in the distribution across the counties, but not a big one. But for SO2 a little bit more, for NOx a little bit more, but it's also prevalent for SO2. Now, and we are explicitly, to your point, because I think that's a good one, we are explicitly comparing that with AP2. So this is the other model, Nick Miller's model, and so we haven't yet compared the difference across those distributions and the differences from county to county, but we'll be doing that. So this doesn't get completely at your point of that, not only doing intermodal comparison, but comparing it also with observation data from the monitors, which I think we should do. But we're getting to this thing of explicitly comparing the two models at least and presenting that in the papers.
What is going on in that CO2 picture?
So what's going on in the CO2 picture is that you're looking at siting 1 kilowatt of solar PV across different counties in the United States, and you're looking for, as you sited in those different locations, what are the emissions of CO2 that you'll be displacing for the grid?
Why is 0 for 20 years?
And in some cases, it is 0 if they are not, if that solar panel is not displacing anything.
Well, why would that be that it wouldn't displace anything for 20 years?
So, wait, but this is not for 20 years. This is just on an annual base, and the distribution, I'm not sure whether it starts at actually.
This is, I'm reading it wrong. We're moving along the curve.
So the most likely value is that on like basically close to a
It's a
median.
probability distribution.
It is a probability. Well, it is a distribution of the damages avoided by county. So it's across different counties that you have in the United States as you cite the solar PV.
Now I get it.
Yes.
You mentioned that you're not taking into account either the import or the exports in your first part of your talk, and I understand that. It's just I don't have a sense of how important that is. I mean, why it might be important is obviously in a state like California that currently has low grams per kilowatt hour. It might actually be consuming lots of actually quite intensive electricity from elsewhere, and so your results might look quite different. I don't have a sense of whether that analysis is going to substantially change your results or whether it's just going to tweak it a little bit, and you probably have a sense of that.
It changes, and so we've used two strategies to tackle that problem. The first one, which was included in that published paper, is instead of using deep-grid subregions, to instead look at everything in terms of NERC regions, which are larger, and so we're confident that there is very limited trade between those regions, but at the same time you lose a little bit on the regional specificity of the emissions that you're having. You're just increasing the size of the region that you're considering. The second thing is, in a paper that we have now under review at the S&T, we rerun our results, but specifically controlling for the imports and exports across regions in every single hour. And it does change a little bit of our results. It goes up and it depends on the region, it's not uniform, but we're now controlling for that. Yeah. Yes?
When you are estimating the social cost, communal cost of CO2, do you include the extreme weather events, which are generally attributed to the thermodynamics of climate change?
So I'm including in that number the different things that the interagency working group did when they ran their integrated assessment models. So everything that they embodied in their analysis is included in here. And the way they really treat this is very coarse in terms of the damages avoided from CO2. It's just one simple function for the, well, some have more sophisticated function of the damages, but yeah, not great. Yes?
Can we go to your negative statements about storage? You're operating the storage to make money on the things that are actually charged, on the price of electricity which is actually charged for. If you took the externalities and said they're really there, you would operate the storage in reverse. You would take the energy out at midnight when it was cheap, but very damaging. Put it in the middle of the day when you have extra natural gas burning. And you'd come out with a positive answer for the social value of your storage. So why not put it that way? We would turn it on first. Until the coal plants are taken away, we'll run it and take energy out of the system at night. And when the coal plants are closed, we'll run it in reverse.
Correct.
The storage plant there, it's ready to use.
The issue there is that it's not the way storage operators are operating it right now. They are using...
They're operating based on policy.
That's right.
That's right. So just fix them.
So I think it would be one step more, that's the message. But one step more in that direction is that I think you actually should co-optimize both. So in the objective function, we should have a maximizing function that includes both the LMP and the profit, plus the externality, and see what sorts of strategies you should pursue in different locations.
The simple of your analyses is taken seriously by policymakers would be not to go in a particular direction, whereas there's such a long time lag in the system, and you can operate in a particular storage. You can operate it differently if you would, and then just change the operating rules of the system is still there.
And that's the message. So as I ended, and I can stress that enough, the conclusions that I derive from this work is not that we don't need those technologies, because we do need those technologies in today to make a transition. The point is, let's not close our eyes and assume that we're getting emission savings unless we actually resolve the problem of decarbonizing the electricity sector. Yes.
A related question. How does storage operate today? Because if it's cost of, if it's the cost, charging when it's cheap and discharging when it's expensive. This variability will very soon and almost non-linear become controlled by the variability of renewable resources rather than by the day and night cycle. So one needs a very small time step to decide, and these storage devices, if they're smart, they might be charging 10 minutes and discharging the next 10 minutes. So how do these rules operate in your model, and how do they actually operate in reality?
So in reality right now, storage provides a whole slew of services, right? Such as frequency regulation, which we're now looking at but is not included in this analysis. We looked at the subset of services, and we are representing the way they operate, which is really they are maximizing profit and making decisions based on their anticipation of local marginal prices from one hour to the next, and decide whether to charge or discharge. It's also the case that it's still a small fraction of the entire system and capacity, right? So that the effects are not at the margin. But the way we're representing it, it's the way it is operated today.
And that profit does not include any carbon or health costs. It's purely the, okay.
It could, right? And yeah. So ideally, if you were to manage the electricity sector in a very vertically integrated way, you take into account the cost of operation plus the externalities as you make, and congestion as you make the decisions on which plants and storage do you have on and off, right? But that's not the way it is operated right now, at least in many regions.
Any questions? Thank you so much for an excellent talk.